Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to the amphitheatre of the École du Louvre. My name is Claire Barbillon, director of the Louvre, and I am delighted to have Émilie Girard, president of ICOM France here today, and Olivier Bonfait, president of the CFHA. This evening's event is in a very unusual event. A couple of weeks ago, there was the adoption of a report by the CESE entitled Countering Restrictions on the Freedom of Artistic Creation and Dissemination. Pressures are increasing on creators and their locations. On the 23rd of April, an interministerial plan was created So this mobilization of public authorities shows us that we can function within crisis. We can protect artists and works. This is the conditions for democratic debate in the world. So we are able to express sensitivity, the comparison of ideas, and spaces where disagreements can be expressed in other ways than by violence. Museums, as you all know, are all directly impacted by this definition. The definition adopted by ICOM in 2023 recalls the roles of the museum, and it also insists on the fact that it is to promote access to the society, encourage reflection, dialogue with all of the public, and welcome the diversity of human experiences. This conception of museums encourages us to see it not just as a place of conservation, but also as a space of knowledge and discussion, where works and heritage is not just preserved, but is placed into relationship with questions of time, a place where different interpretations can be encountered, sometimes divergent. It's founded on research, transmission, and the respect for all. This is the reason why questions of freedom of creation, diffusion, dissemination of works, cultural responsibility, and professional ethics are impacting the museum world. And this is part of the museum's drive to fulfill the missions that society gives it. The École du Louvre is here to train people in museums and cultural mediation. We're not just passing on knowledge or methods. We are preparing our students to exert their responsibilities in contexts of scientific, but also ethical, legal, cultural, and civic considerations. It's at the heart of the creation of this UNESCO chair for Origins International Challenges, and we will be celebrating the opening with the International Symposium on the 22nd and 23rd of June. And of course, you are all invited to this. So ethics is an essential tool, not because it provides ready-made answers, but because it helps us to consider the complexity of situations, to shed light on choices, to align competing issues without pushing aside the principles of our cultural institutions. I would like to thank ICOM France for choosing the École du Louvre to host this event today, along with all of the speakers that will be feeding our discussions today. Thank you to the ICOM teams that prepared the technology that we needed here in this room and the dissemination that goes well beyond these four walls. And I would like to thank the teams, at the École du Louvre to meet new requirements. This has been a lot of work for our small team during examinations period here at our school. I wish you all an excellent evening, and I'm expecting some wonderful lessons. Thank you all.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank ICOM France and the École du Louvre for inviting the French Committee for Art History, Comité Français d'Histoire de l'Art, of which I am president, and APAHAU, the Professional Association of Archaeology and Art History in Universities, of which I am a board member and which I represent here, to these debates, which are always highly interesting. The French Committee for Art History is an association that aims to bring together all professionals in art history and heritage, whether from the museum world, the DRACs, regional directorates of cultural affairs, historical monuments, etc., as well as from the academic world. As a member of the International Committee for the History of Art, it organizes a major international congress every 4 years. The last Congress took place in Lyon in 2024, and there I must admit we faced no constraints whatsoever. However, the next Congress was supposed to take place in Washington in 2028, with a theme that is already perhaps a tiny bit complicated for the United States, I find, sovereignty. Naturally, from the moment a president decided that the Gulf of Mexico was no longer called the Gulf of Mexico, but the Gulf of America, we were right in the middle of sovereignty issues. As you can guess, the Congress organizers very quickly realized that there would be issues regarding access to Washington, visa problems, and so one of the first examples of constraints is that this Congress had to be relocated to Mexico City, and it is scheduled to take place in 2029 instead of 2028. But still looking from the other side of the Atlantic, these constraints can be even stronger. There is a major research center in the United States linked to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, a federal institution called CASVA. At CASVA, for the first time in 2020, as shown on the slide, an eminent figure was chosen as director who had not previously focused on Western art history, but rather on the history of African arts and the global South, so to speak. This person was chosen in 2020, and in 2025, 5 months after the arrival, not far from CASVA, of a new president we all know, this person had to publicly, shall we say, step down. The position of director of CASV then remained vacant for a year before a curator from the National Gallery of Art in Washington was appointed, someone who possesses all the necessary scholarly qualities, but whose previous studies focused on Roman Catholic Baroque sculpture. One might think that, on the other side of the Atlantic, it is simply public institutions that are under constraint due to the current government of the United States. But in fact, private institutions are as well. The famous 3 words of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, 3 principles that, for a few years, had guided hiring policies in universities or exhibitions in museums, sometimes certainly with exaggerations. These 3 principles are now banned from any document, even within private institutions, if those private institutions wish to benefit from tax exemption. And so, the Getty Institute, as wealthy as it may be, can no longer use the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion in any of its documents, along with another list of 150 terms that are thus totally banned, thrown into the fire, so to speak, to evoke European and unfortunately very sad memories. One might think that Europe is unscathed and, in a way, escapes these constraints. I think this evening's debate has shown that this is by no means the case. At the French Committee for Art History, we ourselves raised the alarm a few years ago regarding this appropriation of the notion of heritage by a political faction that denies the notion of universality, along with everything humanistic that heritage can possess, even if it is a universality that was quite often the product of a dominant white male population, but which held universal value and was capable of evolving. And so, it is about seeing the possibility of opening up and sharing this heritage, rather than giving in to an identity-driven heritage panic, or even encouraging this phenomenon of appropriation by a small faction of heritage. A final word regarding the members of APAHAU, the Professional Association of Universities, meaning teacher researchers, who also make up a large portion of the CFHA members. As teacher researchers at the university, we benefit from academic freedom. This is a fundamental principle recognized as such by the Constitutional Council. I quote, "Teachers and researchers enjoy full independence and complete freedom of expression in the exercise of their duties." This is the law of 1984. These freedoms are, to quote the law again, a guarantee of the excellence of French higher education and research. A law aimed at better understanding and protecting the academic freedom of researchers, teachers, and researchers. Sometimes the two populations are not necessarily mixed, was adopted by the Senate and is due to be examined soon by the National Assembly. I am delighted to know that there is also an initiative on the part of the Ministry of Culture, as Claire Barbillon indicated. This law recognizes freedom of research, freedom of teaching, and freedom of expression. I believe that freedom of research will also be something recognized for all heritage curators. That being said, you may remember that 5 years ago, the Minister of Higher Education, a former university professor and university president, not a political figure, wanted to launch an investigation into the Islamo-leftism allegedly rampant at the university. We are never completely safe, unfortunately, from a betrayal of the intellectuals, une trahison des clercs, to satisfy those in power. In my own classes, I realize how much the situation has changed in 20 years. I try never to give in to self-censorship and to maintain freedom of expression. But I admit that I now have to use certain concepts and show certain images with a degree of caution. Images simply of mythological scenes where we see abductions, if not rapes. Above all, each time I try to observe the students' reactions, to prompt them, to encourage them to speak up, to encourage verbalization in order to move past an irrational reaction, to educate, in a way. I admit this is relatively easy in the atmosphere of a classroom where there is a direct relationship of exchange between students and professor. But it is certainly much more difficult in a museum, where there is a sort of natural phenomenon of distance that exists between exhibition visitors and curators, managers, and even sometimes mediators, who fortunately cannot be behind every person visiting. It is also for this reason that I am very interested, as president of the CFHA and representative of APAHAU, to listen to the rest of the debates. I would like to end with one last remark. The freedom of speech offered by an associational space and the unprecedented and undoubtedly necessary nature of bringing together 3 associations and a teaching institution for such a debate is vital. We are certainly moving toward dark times, and I believe these associations already serve as a place of archiving to be able to write the history of these constraints later on.
They are also a place for response, or even reaction, and they are equally a place of solidarity, which is why I attach a great deal of importance to this evening's debate. Thank you. Director of the École du Louvre, dear Claire Barbillon, President of the CFHA, dear Olivier Bonfait, dear colleagues, a big thank you to all of you for joining us this evening for this new session of our cycle of evening debates on ethics. The theme of this evening was born from a discussion with my colleagues from the French Committee for Art History, the Professional Association of Archaeology, Art History, and Universities, and the École du Louvre on what we could do together. And I must say that tonight's topic imposed itself, very unfortunately, very quickly. Recent events over the past few weeks have shown once again that presenting a point of view, an artwork, An artist, an exhibition, or a symposium could be a subject of debate, or even an attempt at cancellation. Even today, we receive numerous, far too frequent alerts from colleagues, and these are no longer the exception. Claire Barbillon spoke just recently about the CESE report, and I thank Vincent Moisselin and Souâd Belhaddad, the two rapporteurs, for being so kind as to be with us tonight. At a time when society is increasingly polarized, when points of view are expressed with virulence, often without nuance, museums are subjected to multiple pressures coming sometimes from activist groups, sometimes from politicians, sometimes from foreign pressures, and sometimes even from within the museum itself or the institutions in charge of heritage. Faced with this situation, the risk of self-censorship is very high. Professionals can be led to ask themselves several questions. Should we put certain works or documents back into storage? Should we continue to exhibit certain subjects? Should we talk about what might cause anger? The fear of a misstep can be experienced by museum professionals as a powerful brake on their freedom to act within their institutions. We have a real risk for democracy ahead of us. These pressures and the forms of self-renunciation they bring to light endanger the social and civic vocation of the museum. In this context, how can we manage to guarantee the conditions for civic dialogue, to encourage critical thinking, and to foster exchange, which is perhaps more necessary than ever and which we earnestly call for? Tonight's gathering, which brings together several associational structures, shows a collective awareness of the threats to scientific and academic freedom, but also a shared reflection that we want to carry forward on how to face these constraints and how to find solutions to them. I thank our speakers tonight for coming to share their experiences and reflections with an honesty that does them honor. A big thank you also to Hélène Jagot, Treasurer of ICOM France, who agreed to moderate this evening. A very big thank you as well to the École de Louvre for hosting us here tonight, in particular to you, dear Claire, to Anaïs Chatain, Director of Studies, who prepared this evening with us, and to Christophe Mill, Marie-Sylvie Pontillo, and Mohamed Mehdi. My usual thoughts also go, as you know, to the ICOM France team, Anne-Claude Maurice and Léane Copin, who are in the control room tonight and who prepare these events throughout the year. Thank you to them. I wish you all a good and profitable evening. And dear Hélène, I turn the floor over to you to introduce these debates. Thank you, Émilie, for that introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues joining us tonight in the Dura Amphitheater at the École du Louvre, or behind your screens across the world, welcome to this evening which brings us together under a title that is oh so topical: Museums Under Constraint, Freedoms, Censorship, and Controversies. A few months ago, the opinion of the CESE, Economic, Social, and Environmental Council, entitled Countering Obstacles to the Freedom of Artistic Creation and Dissemination, shed a harsh light on a reality that we, as museum professionals, observe on the ground. The forms of obstacles are multiplying and polarizing, and while the performing arts have often been on the front line, our museums and exhibition spaces are no longer escaping these precautionary measures, whether they are political, diplomatic, economic, or driven by local or international activist groups. These constraints are now asserting themselves in more or less explicit ways, often amplified by the instant and unnuanced echo chamber of social media. Faced with this virulence, the great danger awaiting our institutions is not just visible protest, but its invisible consequence, the self-censorship that strikes within establishments. Today, one might wonder whether, for fear of a misstep or a media misinterpretation, out of fear of causing offense or controversy, we should relegate disturbing works to storage, smooth out our educational discourse, or give up on exhibiting certain complex subjects. In the end, isn't that running the risk of abandoning the museum's vocation, which is a social, scientific, and civic one? Today, how do we cope? How can we guarantee scientific and programming freedom while remaining attentive to a society undergoing profound identity and social mutations? How can the museum remain that laboratory of critical thinking where we learn to debate rather than clash? To explore these questions in their multiple facets, we are fortunate to welcome a high-quality panel of speakers. First of all, Souâd Belhaddad, journalist and member of the CESE, co-author with Vincent Moisselin, who is also present with us, former director of the SINDEC and former member of the CESE. both of whom are co-authors of the opinion Countering Obstacles to the Freedom of Artistic Creation and Dissemination. Julie Trébault, via video link from New York, director of the Artists at Risk Connection, for an international perspective on the defense of cultural professionals. And to embody the daily life of our institutions facing these museographical challenges, 2 directors of history, society, and fine arts museums, Manon Six, director of the Museums of Le Mans, and Xavier de la Salle, director of the History Museums of Lyon at the Musée Gardini. So first, Souâd Belhaddad to introduce this evening. You are a journalist and senior reporter, playwright, author of numerous award-winning books. You are also a specialist in gathering testimonies from victims of conflict, deeply committed to women's rights and the fight against racism and anti-Semitism. You are also a member of the National Council of Cities and a member of the Economic, Social, and Environmental Council. And it is in this capacity that you are speaking tonight. So Souâd, the opinion for the Economic, Social, and Environmental Council that you co-led with Vincent Moisselin highlights the multiplication of increasingly diffuse pressures, ranging from digital intimidation to budget cuts, creating a climate ripe for self-censorship. And so, based on the work and the 2 hearings you conducted, what is the specificity of these obstacles targeting the heritage and museum sector today compared to the performing arts? And in what way do they directly threaten the role of the museum as a pluralistic and democratic platform, a place of debate and citizenship learning?
So I don't know what question you asked, but if it's about talking a little bit about the issues, shall I go for it then? So I will we will answer you, first of all, because we've encountered a really unprecedented situation, and we want this is a situation that is becoming more and more common. So the first comment is that we will burn. We heard people say a slogan said, "We will burn your books again," which of course takes us back to Berlin in 1934, but we're not in Berlin, we're not in 1935, we're in Brittany in June 2025 in our country, in France, and it was the Pride month, and it was also the month, and there were books on gender and sexual identity in a bookshop, and these were images about what was going on were broadcast. And what we can see is that even if my co-author doesn't like this, there is a real sort of this term, but there's a desacralization, and we've got many examples of this kind of thing happening in all artistic disciplines. So we'll be really focusing tonight on museums, and we've got complaints coming from political parties of different types and different kinds, but most of the time, the vast majority of authors, the perpetrators of these obstacles, have not seen the work that is being incriminated. So together with my co-author, we want to talk about what we have worked on within the publication of this opinion. And we observed that the situation has got worse. The work was done within the Economic, Social and Environmental Council of France, which connects the public authorities with civil society. And we worked on this within the Education and Communication Committee, and we realized, we won't go into all of the details here, but we want to talk to you about some of our key observations. The first observation was the diversity of the people who are creating these kind of obstacles. So before, these came from reactionary movements from the far right, and that even though actually the most of the time, the most serious threats come from the far right political far right or religious far right, often associated with blasphemy and religious identity, often talking about protecting children, with reference also to sexuality and reproductive rights. This is leading to other questions. There are pupils groups that are also raising questions, who want to remove books from libraries for religious or moral reasons, and this religious intolerance is shared between a number of different religious confessions. But today, there are movements fighting for environmental, feminist, or geopolitical rights, and the defenders of a work or a show that is being attacked can then end up censoring another piece or another show. And this is something that's important to understand, because if we look at what we have to fight against, even though that's not the right word, it's difficult to have clear lines. The other observation, and you are on the front line of this, is that culture is working in our country as an indicator of increasing division in France. Our society is increasingly divided and in a growing level of intolerance. We talked about the banalization of hate discourse that is becoming so common in the social level and political level. And so these cultural battles are a symptom of what's going on. And since we want to open up people's imaginations, help people to understand the plural nature of our world without having a universal perspective, we want to multiply viewpoints and introduce nuance. We want to resist a single narrative. And we've already heard in what's been said previously, we want to avoid physical confrontation and create a place for civilized conflict. And this all means people come to a place that what we want to do is bring people together, opposing ideas together without shutting people down. But what we end up with, because people are angry or they feel like they are not being seen, these creation becomes the hostage of ideological issues which are threatening the very meaning of creation and the fact of being free to create. And since there are these different dogmas or even propaganda, it's about questioning not the work or the content of a work or show, but it's about raising the question about the right for such and such a work or show to be performed. And so there is a legitimate, what can have a sense of being a legitimate protest, which moves towards standing against and breaking the freedom of artistic expression. Given the situation and the current climate, the different players in performing arts, for example, are having problems returning to the stage after what they've encountered. Sometimes they experience depression, or sometimes even worse, they leave their profession. And we have festival directors who are encountering many threats and therefore cancelling many performances. And so artists are almost withdrawing despite themselves. There's a kind of self-censorship which they're not even quite aware of. We interviewed Laetitia Bourget, who's a visual artist who is based in a small town of 4,000 people, and in her work, where she works with an organic material, she's met hostility in her daily work, which has led to the cancellation of some of her exhibitions, and sometimes the the removal of some of her works. And so she has a collective that has been created in her village to protest against her works. And I'd really like us to hear from her. She says, the practices that I had 30 years ago are no longer possible, otherwise I would be ostracized. I am considered as a partisan. I've worked a lot with living materials and organic materials, which is not generally controversial. People see sexualization in what I produce, and this is often a fantasized image and not necessarily what I'm aiming for. It leads people to avoid what I'm producing. She explains that she seeks to encourage dialogue. She has an open workshop with wide windows and invites people to come and speak, but she had to make an official complaint when she discovered that her own children at school have been threatened by these protesters. Festival directors, bookshop owners are facing these issues, and we have elected officials who are considering that public power, public authority is being a weapon in this cultural wars. And we have some contradictory examples here. So, for example, we have a film called Sacré-Cœur, which is a film about the appearance of Christ to Saint Marguerite. And on one side, we've got the Socialist City Hall of Marseille, which an hour before its showing cancelled it on the basis of a principle of a secular culture and public service, something which was written into French law in the separation of church and state. And then in Ile-de-France, in Clichy, you've got a mayor who's a right-wing mayor who has no prerogative on this issue, but who imposed the programming of this same film. And so the local cultural director cancelled because considered there was a political interference here, and therefore resigned. And so there's this question of whether this is the kind of culture we're going to accept in the future. Of course not. You have heard and understood the extent to which the challenge here is beyond culture. It's about democracy. And while there is no specific attack on museums, at least in the report that we produced, we talked to a number of different authors, etc. But it seems, and it's going to really be very interesting to hear from you about this, it seems that some of you are seeing a real challenge at an artistic level, but also a scientific level associated with a universal and single point of view that is allowed. Final point to wrap up is that in these sensitivities that are being shaken up by a particular work, the committee that we worked with wanted to make sure that people could hear what was being said. Because if art is universal, if there are minorities, people, women, for example, who might feel that they are invisible in the context of artistic creation, and they have the feeling that this challenge against them leads them to feel invisible. And Vincent will come back to this later on, but there's a support for these groups of people. But so we wanted to say there is the law, but there's a big difference between the law and ethics, and really this whole phenomenon raises ethical questions.
So we are going to be hearing from Julie Trébault, who is CEO of Artists at Risk Connection. So ARC is an international organization dedicated to the defense of at-risk art, and before that you worked for 15 years in Europe and in the US, particularly at Quai Branly, University of Van Leiden in the Netherlands, and a university in New York as well. You regularly speak at conferences internationally on the rights of artists. Artists at Risk Connection was created in 2017, and you have helped over 2,300 artists and cultural stakeholders across many countries. In January 2025, you published a survey of US artists, the Association of Art Directors. Around half of them claimed that they had been subjected to pressure to not exhibit offensive artworks or artworks thought to be offensive. Censorship is now a bigger problem for museums. While preparing this panel discussion, you told me that this problem got worse during Trump's first term, but has accelerated during his second term. The basis of his term being idealized traditional values means that there is a permanent cultural refusal of wokeism with a rewriting of American colonial history and positive gender discrimination, as Olivier mentioned. So today, how is ARC working every day to defend the freedom of expression in the arts and academics in the US? And can you share any other examples of democratic countries that are not necessarily idyllic? Thank you very much. Can you hear me? We could hear you great. It was crystal clear. You were fully audible, so thank you. So good evening to all of you. I'm delighted to be with you. First of all, I wanted to thank ICOM France and the École du Louvre for organizing this event. This really shows the growing importance of these kinds of events in cultural institutions in the US, like in many other democracies. So as we're facing pressures, as I said, I'm executive director of ARC, Artists at Risk, and we directly support artists and cultural professionals facing threats due to their work, their identity, or their commitment in political and cultural life. I wanted to start my talk today with a fundamental question. What is the mission of museums within democratic societies? This question is unique at a time where many democracies are facing increased limitation of public discourse and the education and creative sectors are being limited. There is increased harassment as well. As part of ARC, we have observed the accentuation of these phenomena in the US in recent years. These dynamics are especially visible in the American context, but are also manifested in various ways across European countries, such as in France, as we just heard. And museums and cultural institutions are finding themselves at the heart of debate around history, identity, colonialization, and gender. So, despite the controversies they face, museums do remain the institutions that have the highest level of public confidence, as a study shown from the American Association of Museums here in the US, due to their legitimacy as sources of knowledge and transmission. They are unique spaces where people from different backgrounds, experience, etc., can learn and discover new things, but also meet pair their ideas and help build civic discourse, which has become increasingly fragile in our contemporary societies. This responsibility is at the heart of the definition adopted by the International Council of Museums in 2022, presenting the museum as a not-for-profit permanent institution in the service of society that researches, collects, conserves, interprets, and exhibits tangible and intangible heritage. Open to the public, accessible and inclusive, museums foster diversity and sustainability. So this goes beyond considering museums a simple place of conservation. It recognizes their civic role in helping us understand the world and their culture and their identity. Confidence is at the heart of the mission. Frédéric Douglas, who is an ardent defender of pluralism, wrote that confidence is the basis of all society. Where there is no truth, there can be no trust, and where there is no trust, there can be no society. Museums are at the crossroads of history and democratic vitality. The situations American museums are facing are becoming very difficult, increasingly complex and structural as well. Unlike many European museums, US institutions strongly depend on private philanthropy. The interests of their board of directors, sponsors, meaning that their funding is especially vulnerable to political events, as we have seen. Questions of institutional independence and public responsibility are called into question. And at the same time, many American museums in recent years have managed to expand their representation in their programs, trying to replace marginalized people who have long been absent, Indigenous Afro-American artists, LGBTQ+, migrant communities, topics around racism, colonialism, forced displacement, etc. And this is much broader as part of a drive for cultural pluralism that goes beyond museums. In the US, over 2,500 books have now been censored in the US. There's restructuring on how history, race, gender, sexuality, colonialism are taught, and diversity and inclusion programs have been shut down. There is increased involvement of politics in higher education and cultural institutions such as museums, with incentives to avoid controversial topics that don't fit the dominant narrative imposed by the current American administration. Recently, there was relative consensus on teaching of slavery in the past, colonialism. There's a new battle around these topics now. Museums have become one of the main battlegrounds of these issues. As Hélène said, ARC worked in partnership with PEN America, the Association of Art Museum Directors, with his study. It was published in January 2025, showing worrying trends. Over 75% of directors said that they have experienced pressure to not show certain works of art or exhibits, and have experienced harassment over the past 3 years. Some artists, some subjects were particularly facing this. 82% said that it was because of the artist's race or ethnicity. In 80% of cases, the controversies were associated with artists identifying as LGBTQ+. This is not formal state censorship. There are different layers of censorship, placing pressure on museums. It's a very diffuse pressure that's very effective. Worries from the board of trustees, the sponsors, political and ideological controversies, and also social media hate campaigns and fears linked to finances that this administration began in January 2025, cutting certain funds for artists and for cultural institutions. One of the directors we questioned said that one of the main issues of this time is the emergence of a grey zone where institutions modify their decisions not because they are legally required to, but because they are scared of the consequences of public controversy. I do have a lot of respect for my colleagues who are museum directors as they are facing an impossible situation. It's important to recognize that they have to preserve artistic freedom, protect their teams, serve diverse publics, ensure the long-term survival of their institution, and respond to the legitimate concerns of their community. This is a lot of responsibility for a single person to carry on their shoulders. This phenomenon does not seem to be limited just to the US. In lots of democracies, including those with a long history of cultural freedom and openness, we are seeing issues. This shows that academic and cultural freedom, the freedom of expression, are deeply interdependent. A question is increasingly asked to academic and cultural institutions. How can we preserve their missions, their independence, and their ability to have a complex discussion within a world that's increasingly polarized? So a number of research initiatives, support initiatives, and training initiatives are in place. ARC has supported over 2,500 different artists in 85 different countries over the past few years. We provide direct assistance to these artists with emergency subsidiaries, resilience subsidiaries, and safety training, well-being techniques that are adapted to their needs. ARC documents attacks on artistic freedom in the world and identify trends in order to alert the public authorities and to do advocacy work. And increasingly, cultural and museum institutions are being equipped to better prepare themselves for social media hate campaigns, for instance. In late 2025, we launched a national survey on artist safety with 1,553 artists and cultural workers in the US. This shows an increased feeling of vulnerability. 76% feel negatively about the state of artistic freedom in the US since the arrival of the new administration. Almost half feel unprepared to face threats. And almost a third have had to cancel some of their work due to harassment. Institutions cannot wait for the crisis to occur before responding. It's not just censorship that's the danger, it's the gradual normalization of self-censorship, anticipated self-censorship when artists avoid certain topics before the pressure is even there. We need to prepare. The most resilient institutions are those with clearly defined editorial principles, established procedures before a crisis happens, a clear vision of their responsibility towards artists, public, and their teams. There are sustained relationships with communities, researchers, and artists instead of limiting discussions to institutions and politicians. So finally, they are stronger when they act together. Causes, one of the main issues surrounding safety is to be isolated. The idea is to isolate artists and institutions. Solidarity is not just a value, it really responds to an urgent need. The issues we're facing are not just in the US. In Brazil, closure of the Queer Museum in 2017 was a major turning point. The controversy around this shows a normalization of online hate campaigns, political pressure, limiting what artists can say about gender and sexuality. In Germany, cultural institutions are now at the heart of sensitive discussions around Palestine, artistic freedom, and limits to that. Controversies in 2022. And after the 7th of October, the terrorist attack and the annexation of Gaza have led to some wonderful exhibitions, public speaks, and cultural partnerships. So there are differences, but there is a key common point. Museums are spaces where there is broader debate about identity, cultural memory, and political identity. It's not just about what is exhibited in museums. It's if museums can continue to be places where complexity, disagreement still remain possible. It's not about whether they can discuss difficult topics, it's whether they can continue to do so while maintaining intellectual integrity and trust. So museums are not just places of conservation, they are public institutions for collective memory, interpretation, and public debate, which gives them a special kind of importance in a polarized climate. Museums create the conditions for reflection so that they can confront complexity without falling into simplification. There is a plurality of perspectives without requiring uniformity. In societies marked by mistrust and polarization, this is increasingly possible. Not because they need to be partisan, because they are attached to truth and intellectual integrity. And they are themselves a fundamental condition for democratic life. The question that we need to ask ourselves is how museums in the US, France, and elsewhere can remain spaces where difficult conversations are still possible, where artists and cultural workers can continue to create freely, institutions that do not renounce complexity at a time when societies need it more than ever. The response is not going to come from artists or museums alone. It requires collective engagement from all cultural institutions, public authorities, civil society, the media, the academics, and the public in order to have the conditions for freedom of expression, because this goes way beyond the cultural sector. What society do we want to live in? Societies that are capable of confronting their history, to identify the complexity, to welcome plurality, or societies where they are afraid of controversy? Museums can overcome when they act collectively, when they take on their public responsibility and they consistently defend artistic freedom so that they can help conserve the life, the democratic life that we want. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for that really interesting presentation, even though it's rather worrying. I think this connects into what a number of us see, and it's ICOM France that's bringing us together. And so there's the notion of collective, which is perhaps the central point of what you've mentioned. And Julie, you're talking really about this need for solidarity between the different cultural actors, between museums, between artists, curators, museum directors, etc. We need to work together in order to resist increasingly coordinated attacks, increasingly radical attacks, thanks, of course, to social media and the violence that all of this can lead to, the aggressive nature, because it's so much easier behind your computer to attack somebody than in a room, at a conference, at a symposium. So this idea of solidarity is really very central. It's perhaps the star, the light at the end of the tunnel in really what you've been sharing. Even though I think that this question of the grey zone and self-censorship is a real danger, which is we're encountering more and more, and I can see quite a lot of students here and curator students from the INP here, and it might be interesting for the INP to perhaps offer modules on risk management, and I think that's going to be important because we are all going to be confronted one day in our career with these questions, even though some time ago these are questions that really were never raised. So let's go into some very concrete questions now, linked into local territories, and we're going to do that with Manon 6. Manon, you are a historian, you are part of the scientific committee in France Museum from 2017 to 2019. You joined the Cultural Affairs of the Pays de la Loire as an advisor for museums before moving to the Musée de Bretagne in Rennes in 2017 as the head of the conservation department, where you oversaw a number of major projects, including planning of future storage facilities and the digital dissemination policy, as well as a number of collections. And in particular, you curated the exhibition that we'll be talking about this evening, which was called Celtic with a question mark, and that was in 2022. And you have been director of the Le Mans Museums since September 2025. So just to come back to Celtic, in 2022, the Museum of Brittany in Rennes presented this exhibition, Celtic with a question mark, which was important. And this led to quite a polemical situation which impacted the whole culture around the region. And the whole question was around a sensitive question about whether Brittany was really a Celtic area, or whether this was just an invented legend. And so that was what it was really about. And there was this showed the huge gap that there can be between the scientific deconstruction of a historical narrative and the perception of a population. So Manon, perhaps you could talk to us about how you dealt with the situation, what correctives you put in place, and what you've learned as well. Thank you, Hélène, and thank you, ICOM. I hope everyone can hear me, because we've got another microphone here, and apparently it's working, so that's great. So we're going to move away from the USA to a case which is closer to home, an exhibition in Brittany, this exhibition, Celtic. And I just want to talk briefly about the Museum of Brittany, which is a museum organized and was put in place primarily after the Second World War, following the reorganization of a number of regional museums in France. And it worked with this very recent material and of the Second World War. It came to existence through a number of different challenges, but it eventually came to see the day through a project around Celtic history and its impact today. And so this could have been even the name of the Museum of Brittany, which was focused at the time on archaeological work. And after it focused on that, the project was put to one side. And this is not just an anecdote, because what this tells us is that the museum institution has constantly been impacted by contemporary society's questions. Museums are always the expression of ideological issues. It's not something that's static or timeless. And I think that's perhaps something that's been lost in the understanding of the history of some museums. Museums are, first of all, a product of society, and they're the only one that makes it possible to look at the representations a society has of itself and produces of itself. And so this representation can be examined, and therefore museums make choices. This represents, of course, a commitment, a choice, a decision. And sometimes museums present a critical forum, a role as a critical forum, because it's one of its key missions. The Musée de Bretagne, in its first years and then from the 1990s when it was developed again, is a museum that seeks to be a bit provocative, to break with the codes, and to perhaps not follow the line expected at the time, the line perhaps that the state wanted it to follow. It's a museum that provides content that raises questions, but it's also a visionary museum, which tries to speak for Brittany, because following the Second World War, a lot developed in the far west of France, in this region. Today, the Musée de Bretagne has become a fully fledged museum of society, which is trying to avoid falling into the pitfalls of nationalism or regionalism, identity, and tries to tell cultural and historical stories from a neutral perspective, moving away from kind of the folklore that had been developed following the Second World War. This is important as well, because this is a challenge in itself. Why? Because most of these museums in the 19th century, which were founded in the 19th century, they contributed perhaps to an extent to fixing things in time, to freezing things in time. They produced images of a particular culture by collecting, preserving, conserving, and presenting objects and practices which was considered traditional, in inverted commas. And this is a notion that really can be questioned, the notion of tradition. But these museums carried the identity of a particular region by making their identity into a particular region. And once museums present things as truth, then this becomes truth for people. Therefore, museums are not exempt from the way in which cultural identities are formed. And that was really what we wanted to look at through this exhibition, Celtic. And the idea of looking at these different facets of the identity of Brittany. Thank you, you're moving the PowerPoint forward for me. And so this was all based on an observation that in our permanent exhibition, there was a sequence focused on Celt and Celtic attitudes or culture. And this was the starting point for our exhibition. There's all in this context. There was a phrase, a statement in the permanent exhibition which said, belonging to a Celtic culture revived by Celtic nights and other Halloween celebrations must come to terms with the fact that there is no direct link between today's cultural practices and those of ancient peoples. So when we went back to the Gauls, the first Celts, they had been presented in so many different ways. And in Brittany, of course, this was a cultural phenomenon which was well known and was present everywhere in Brittany. It was present in supermarkets, in cultural festivals. There was always this kind of Celtic attitude. And this, we felt, was something that needed to be examined. It was not really about asking whether Brittany was Celtic, but to what extent Brittany had somehow crystallized this Celtic identity more than other territories, because you know that Celts were well beyond, traveled and moved well beyond Brittany. So we were looking to use an exhibition system that we already had put in place in our museum, the question of deconstruction, as was mentioned. And so we'd already worked on cliches in other projects. So then we put in place a scientific committee made up of historians, archaeologists, art historians, musicologists, because we also need to think about these music and culture, other cultural areas. And we also had linguists in this group, because there's the Celtic language, which is still remembered in Brittany. And the idea of thinking about this representation, which was generally accepted, and the gap between that and reality, and that was really what we were wanting to look at. So we tried to present an argument by saying that the scientific perspective that we're bringing, we want to work with facts, cultural facts and historical facts, and that's what we're going to offer. The exhibition opened in March 2022, and for about 2.5 months, nothing really happened. And then suddenly, there was a reaction from some media personalities who took position, and which was picked up by academics and led to a rapid acceleration via social media and communication, which led to people taking sides at a political level, because in Brittany, it's very common that there is that things that conflict can be exacerbated very quickly, and we can saw blogs, websites, articles feeding in and all piling into this debate. What seemed really very important to us, first of all, at least, and really without any, we didn't really have a bad perspective of this. We could really saw the vivacity of this regional response, which is something that's really very positive. This led to research, and it really connected into something that was going on locally. It was really interesting. Nevertheless, the subject that we were working on in 2022, since the first research at the end of the 18th century on Celtomania, the research had never really come to a consensus at scientific level. Why? Because the word Celt means different things for historians, for archaeologists, or for linguists. These are notions that are really very variable. There's the local language, the Celtic language in Brittany, but for archaeologists, they don't really want to use the word Celtic because it's full of notions from the 19th century. So there was no real scientific consensus around this. So the debate really spread like wildfire. We tried to analyze it. Very quickly, what we saw was that it was important to listen. It needed to listen to what was being said. There was a lot of debate around this question mark, which was for us a way of looking at this specific question, but actually it was seen as a value judgment, as a raising doubts. And people felt that we were raising doubts, we're trying to introduce doubt about the fact that Brittany was Celtic, while we were trying to actually introduce some nuance based on scientific and historical facts. We were not given that. People felt that we were denying them the right to say that they were Celtic and to feel this Celtic identity. And that's what came out. The narrative film associated with the exhibition was also very controversial because we had a very academic, scientific approach, or perhaps it was even a bit school-like, because perhaps we need to admit this. We started with Celts in the Iron Age, and we were trying to show that this Celtic identity, this regional cultural identity, like other national identities, were formed in the 19th century on the basis of a system, of a mechanism that we can see in other territories. This work came a lot from a historian called Anne-Marie Thiès, who'd worked a lot on cultural national identities and the way in which they were formed. Today, saying that culture is not innate but is developed, created an issue, and very often we found ourselves confronted with the risk of confronting these scientific and historical facts and the feelings of people living in the region. They wanted to be able to feel this Celtic identity, and we were caught in the dilemma of seeking to communicate some key notions while also taking into account this very emotional cultural feeling. So the question mark and some different cultural outreach tools sought to talk about cliches, break down cliches, and sometimes they were considered as too simple and simplistic. And once again, I'll come back to the fact that our goal is to take a complex debate and help visitors from many different backgrounds to understand. And we talked about humor and tried different ways in order to communicate these notions. Talking about Celtomania from the 18th century is something that we wanted to touch on. But as soon as we reached questions around identity in a climate where there can be a lot of polarization, actually humor and even sarcasm can be really very poorly received, because once again it can be perceived as a value judgment on the part of some visitors. Some notions, of course, could be developed. What also seemed really very important to us was that an exhibition is not a book, it's not a thesis, it's not a catalogue. We have space. We can develop some things, and so therefore an exhibition, sorry, in books you have space to develop ideas, but in an exhibition you have to make choices. There has to be a selection. You can't say everything. And the opportunity to help people understand this scientific mechanism was really particularly difficult, because visitors were looking for a total perspective. We're talking about Brittany in the broader sense, and there was visitors where you're talking at this aspect. Why don't you talk about that? Why don't you talk about other aspects? So sometimes our approach was seen as too reductionist. The conclusion of the exhibition was really fairly open and presented the question of identity construction as something that's very positive. We said, yes, it's a construction, but it's something that feeds us, something that is part of the way that communities, that makes communities stick together, and it's a heritage that needs to be perceived in a very positive way, because of course in heritage, cultural heritage that's important is cultural heritage that is developed. And we explained that it's not something that's frozen in time, but this conclusion in the first few months was really very interesting and well received. It's interesting to look at the visitor comments, who said that the question was really very open, but then people felt that we didn't actually really answer the question, and they left asking the question of whether Brittany was Celtic or not, and the question was never really answered. That was in the first few months, but once the debate became more aggressive after the first media responses and academic responses, at that point there's a real bias in people's perspective. People talked about the exhibition without coming. People come, but they interpreted everything and all the text in a completely biased way in order to align with the interpretation that they'd read in the media. So we really were then in a much more polarized context. In terms of things that we did to correct what happened, because of course we needed to respond. Of course we had a response, a crisis response, and now I can do crisis response. What was really very important is that, of course, this kind of response does really impact the museum team, because Julie was talking about the fact that people self-censor because they want to avoid certain reactions. Well, we hadn't expected any reactions. We thought that there might be this kind of debate, but the way in which things happened really went beyond the normal kind of response you'd expect for a cultural event, even in Brittany. And what seemed really very important to us was to keep listening, but very quickly we were thinking, what should we do? Should we answer all these different comments? Should we modify things? Should we do a specific study? The idea was to put in place an opportunity for visitors to express themselves, to ask questions. So written questions, they wrote down their questions, and we committed to answer within a week, which would these questions could respond to the people asking the questions, but also to visitors following on after them. So that was the first opportunity we had in terms of interaction with visitors in a very concrete manner. Then there was a broader question, and I would say that what's up on the slide in front of you was really a guide for us. I perhaps didn't go into this, but we had planned a fairly long exhibition time here because we opened in March. It ran through till December, so this was an increased challenge. So the idea of reaffirming the legitimacy of this subject was really important because we are a museum of society, and it was important for us to stay aligned with this subject, which seemed very contemporary from our perspective, and it seemed really important that we should align with this. We had to adapt as a team, had to learn very quickly in our team in order to educate people. We needed to think about the way that our outreach team, who were in dealing directly with the public, about how they were responding, and sometimes they had to encounter rather aggressive reactions. And we had to refute as well. The third line that you can see on the screen is that we had to refute any attempt of character assassination and focus in responding rightly. And then we also needed to admit areas where we had been clumsy, which made it possible for us to adapt some of the texts that we had initially presented in the exhibition. So we were not changing the meaning of the texts, but we were thinking about what might have been considered offensive in terms of a value judgment around some particular questions. So that is the kind of adaptation that we were able to put in place over this fairly long exhibition. So we kept listening, kept dialoguing with visitors. We kept constantly looking for peace and peaceful dialogue. We carried out an audience survey, which was already planned, and we covered 22,000 people. And actually, criticism came from a minority of visitors, but these visitors had a loud enough voice to lead to specific responses and reactions. The vast majority of visitors reassured us about the way in which this exhibition had been received. We read all the articles that were published and all the posts on social media. Not everything was cordial, to say the least. We tried to put in place some adjustments and offer some other perspectives, inviting associations who had a radically different perspective to us, to the exhibition, and we invited them to present the exhibition and to offer guides to the exhibition. And then a publication that came out late for purely administrative reasons. We produced a catalogue of the exhibition late, and it made it possible for us to put in place an editorial that responded to this controversial situation. In the medium term, the lessons that are perhaps the most important to really take away was the fact that this was not an impossible subject, that we should never have perhaps covered this subject, that was the question. We put the museum in a difficult situation. But no, this was not an impossible question. About 20 years before, the museum had thought that about doing this, but the museum had refused it 20 years ago because they felt that the people in the region were not necessarily ready. But actually, it was possible to cover this question because debate is necessary. And in terms of debate, we really hit the target. We gave visitors the opportunity to forge their own opinion about a specific subject. Some had a number of different reactions, some left comments, and we gave the opportunity here to visitors to start thinking about this question. The responses tell us there was really a real issue here, a real debate. Then there's question of scientific presentation in this complex situation with complex data. This is something that obviously we need to work on in order to not end up in a simplistic situation and to move away from very fast division in terms of the way that we present things. The work done with local groups was something that was really very important because we can always talk about history in exhibitions, we can talk about scientific research, but what makes something, what builds cultural heritage comes from a weaving of multiple layers of things, and perhaps this is where we need to see the way in which things are built. Even if we have a very clear scientific message, we cannot get away from the way in which people perceive and experience things, particularly around identity questions.
So, when thinking about the perfection or the imperfection of a topic, this is very relative. Obviously, we would do this exhibition very differently in the future. Different notions would have been identified by that point. The idea is to be mobile in our research, mobile intellectually as well. And this is undeniable. What's very important is that the attention given to our exhibition shows the real trust that people have in what is exhibited. This is a positive fact that we were able to conserve from this demonstrative experience, remaining an essential institution within the imagination of many visitors in the content that we offer as well. And this is the positive that we have taken away from this unusual adventure. Thank you very much, Manon. Congratulations to the teams of the Musée de Bretagne for facing up to this situation. I know that it was not very easy. I was in the scientific board and I experienced this situation from the inside. To go back to what you were saying, what's interesting is we can see that the public's reaction was to say that the museum didn't give ready-to-think solutions. There was not a definitive answer. So, museum was not open to debate in advance, was what they were saying. You were able to solve this kind of misalignment. And I think it's interesting because the question of community is not necessarily easy for French museums, unlike American museums. These kinds of experiences do speak very loudly, and there are lessons that we can take. We can see that civil society is involved very strongly in our debates in the exhibition subject, which is a choice fundamentally with restricted scope, because we can't say everything, write everything, exhibit everything. So justification of a choice by a museum is essential. So thank you very much for sharing. We are now going to move over to the Rhône with Xavier de la Selle. You are director of the Gardaigne Museum, and you have been president of the FEMS from 2022 to 2026. You have also gone through major controversy in December 2023 following the reopening of the fourth and final permanent exhibition at Gardaigne Museum, dedicated to the city's political history, in particular its institutional history and civic engagement on major issues such as ecology and feminism. Through collaborative work with citizens and experts, the museum and you, Xavier de la Selle, you found yourselves at the center of a smear campaign of rare ferocity in the hushed world of museums, with criticism leveled not only at elected representatives, but also at the Ministry of Culture. So it went quite far up. And the highlighting of recent social movements, feminist struggles, gender issues, labor history, and environmental concerns was perceived by your detractors as an attempt at a political rewriting of local history, described by some as a woke deviation. The affair has highlighted an ideological divide over the very definition of a local history museum, pitting a traditional, not to say backward-looking, even reactionary vision of heritage against the contemporary societal approach. So, Xavier, drawing on this experience and its consequences, as well as your perspective as a former president of the FEMS, how do you view the construction of the narrative currently promoted by social history museums? How can we address subjects on which there is no consensus? How can we successfully maintain the scientific integrity of a place where people can listen to each other debate, drawing on this example from the Museum of Gardaigne? Thank you very much for this introduction. Good evening to all of you. Thank you for inviting me here. I think that you've really summarized what happened. I will go into greater detail. And following on from Julie and Manon's talks, you're going to be able to see the lessons that are quite convergent. I'll be able to add one or two aspects that are maybe complementary. So I'm going to share my screen. I don't know if you can see that. Yes, it's perfect. Thank you. So this is a view of the Museum Gardaigne, this Renaissance era building. So I'm just going to remind you of the facts. I will be quite concise so we don't spend too much time on this. The Museum of the History of Lyon was an institution opened in early 21st century in 1901 with a political objective to have it as a museum of society, not called that. It was attached to a growing family of museums, city museums across Europe and in the US. These museums were dedicated to the life of a city. These are now called city museums, and they often carried the name of the city. The Museum of London, the Museum of Amsterdam, the Museum of Lisbon, for example, are equivalent museums where the word history is not included. Gardaigne kept the title Museum of the History of Lyon. One of my predecessors in the late 90s, early 2000s, did major renovation of the building's architecture, and repositioning of the cultural and scientific mission of the institution in order to bring it back into the family of city museums, which are a kind of territorial and society museum, sharing the same ideological position as what was evoked today. The question of understanding the territory, the narrative that serves the interpretation of a territory so that its inhabitants can situate their own personal experiences in space and time. A museum is characterized by its reason for being rather than the nature of its collections. So that's what we've been talking about since earlier. We've been talking about the fact that a museum is not just a space for conservation, but also a space for discourse and debate. I would say that if we take, for example, the Federation of Eco Museums, the society museums we've been talking about, that are now characterized by heritage institution groups that desire to consider their reason for being, their existence, rather than the collection. Yes, museums remain spaces defined by the existence of their collections, but their existence explains the missions that they are trying to respond to. In the 2000s, a new museography was adapted and adopted across the museum, with collections and presentations in chronological order of the main pieces in the collection. In the 2015-2020 period, with the team and the municipality of Lyon, we wanted to fully redo the permanent collection of the Museum of History of Lyon based on urban narratives. We received successive funding up to 2023, and the fourth and final exhibition was opened in December. There were 4 complementary exhibitions, and we saw the 5-year project draw to a close in December 2023 with the fourth and final permanent exhibition dedicated to the city's political history, a space of power where political opinions are expressed, but also through the question of urban citizenship, a city as a political expression by excellence. So the aim was to talk with the municipality, the assistant mayor for culture wanted to discuss the content. A few questions were raised about more recent history in the city. Should we mention the current mayor or the previous mayor? These sorts of questions. We had interesting conversations that allowed me to move forward on with the project to try and win the trust of elected officials. So we opened the exhibition in early December with requests from the municipality to communicate on the renewal of exhibitions rather than just discuss the politics, talk about institutional authorities, but also civic engagement. The name of the exhibition was and is Lyonnaise Engagement in the City. We had a press pack and organized a press visit on the opening, and we welcomed certain journalists, including a journalist from the Figaro newspaper that expressed some criticism on the day, and a couple of days later they published in the online Figaro an incendiary article that virulently attacked the museum, the permanent exhibition, its content, and the project. Before going into the projects, I'm going to just show you some examples. We worked with a fresco going back over civic engagement in Lyon. So some of this civic engagement had national or even international repercussions, such as the March for Equality, welcoming prostitutes in a Lyon church in 1975, if I'm not mistaken, and is now considered as the date of the International Day of Sex Workers, because the commitments from the church were such in this instance that it could be expressed globally. We talked about feminist engagement as well, and going back to the 19th century particularly, and also engagement that has been in the environmental or ecological sphere. The content of this exhibition and previous exhibitions, which was on labor and industrial history of Lyon, and the question of labor and immigration, work, immigration, the role of women, etc. Things that seem quite simple and consensual today, reflecting the historical work of the past few decades as well. So then this article was published that criticized the museum, criticized certain researchers, mentioned the involvement of the state, reminding people that this is part of the museum's program, which is approved by the state. This is the usual procedure. So some of the researchers and exhibition teams were attacked. The article was published on the Action Française and Français de Souche website and across social media. It was also on the Figaro website where they had 300 messages, critical messages. Since that, I was also attacked personally by name. I'm not going to go into more detail. It's not worth recalling these difficult events. But other more local press published articles that you can see. There's an article from the Progrès, the regional daily, that mentions ideology, that this is a toy of municipal power as the museum, and other media that identified the activist, anti-wokeist nature of the Figaro article reacted. So we could see this kind of media battle locally and more broadly. I haven't put the title of the media here, but this wasn't television that went into things. And here you can see the adjective wokeist. So this wasn't actually mentioned in the Figaro, but it came up into the debate. A right-wing journalist that was surprised by these attacks went to visit the exhibition. Lots of people came to visit the exhibition following on from the appearance of this article, but were actually surprised when they came out. They didn't see what the journalist had been talking about. Many people kicked off on social media, on Google, opinions as well, giving bad reviews on Google reviews to try and put 1 star. And slowly, in a few weeks, the score went down from people that had never actually been to the museum and will probably never visit the museum. So we were in this whirlwind. We can see words appearing very quickly, panic, things like that. And what was interesting to note as well, and this is similar to what my previous colleague was saying, this question of polemy, controversy, which can be seen as something negative by more moderate people, to be the subject of some kind of controversy with contrasting sides may mean that we did it wrong, as if museums were supposed to be a place of consensus, calm, somewhere where nothing happens. And when there is a polemy, this kind of controversy, it's that we've not done our job properly. So this is the effect that we had. The first reaction that the museum team felt was surprise, astonishment. We weren't prepared for it. And I had a kind of naivety. We were perhaps a little bit too sure of what we wanted to do. We weren't trying to be provocative. It wasn't even a desire on our part. Like with the Museum of Brittany, we were trying to be funny with certain museographical choices. So once we'd recovered our spirits a little bit, politically, just to let you know, the link with the municipality, what was difficult for us to experience was that the assistant mayor for culture rejected us, and there started to be tension between the executives in the mayor's office on the left side with the Green movement, and we were rejected. And in interviews that she gave, she said that the museum would be able to modify certain things. We trust the scientific community, but we'll review certain things. So at a municipal council, different positions were declared. Many people hadn't actually visited the museum, but decided that they had a lot to say. This lasted for many weeks. Many articles were written. An art review talking about museography and the presentation of articles. It was a little bit less political. And we had an initial response focused on what we now call crisis management, particularly communication and press, writing a right of reply that we were never able to get from the Figaro, that responded with administrative arguments. When we modified certain things, this was not mentioned. So we took the offensive again. I don't like this term, but we produced a press saying Gadagne is not doing caricatures, they're doing an exhibition. And the idea was to defend the project, to defend the museum, to defend its position with terms formulated in a way where we were a bit more moderated than usual. And we wanted to be visible so that people were not just saying whatever they wanted in the article. There were certain things that were factually wrong by this journalist and by others who had been speaking in the press. So this was a communication and media first offensive. We spoke up once again. We were a little bit alone with the municipality that was supporting us, but not giving much. We had to manage this internally. So my colleagues working in communication were former journalists. They know the political sphere, and we're able to get a little bit of help from an elected official as well to discuss these issues that we were not sufficiently prepared for. So time has moved forward with hindsight now, the benefit of hindsight. The exhibition is still open to the public. It's a permanent exhibition. Debate is expressed in our guest book. It's quite amusing. So sometimes online and in the guest book, visitors write very negative comments. This does happen sometimes. It's never been the majority. It is increasingly rare. People who aren't happy, who accuse us ideologically about being activists, talking about certain topics that make us left-wing activists. And discussion continues in our guest book. Some people will write in the guest book on the opposite page, giving a more positive comment and criticize what was written on the page before, actually addressing the person who had written in the guest book before. This is very interesting. We try to compare what's being written in the guest book, what's being written online, how people see it. So just to say that it is still a place of study to see how things are moving forward. So that's what happened. That's how we reacted at the time and how we're still reacting today. 1 year on, we organized within the FEMS and the Museum of Brittany and other colleagues a day of study in Villeurbanne and Lyon called When Exhibitions Disturb. And we were able to come back over some of this situation and the reaction that we had. So as not to go on too long, I would now like to mention some points, some considerations that come from the immediate reactions that we had 2.5 years ago now, and how we are experiencing the situation now. I'm going to discuss this perhaps without any order in what I'm saying. My comments and the consequences should not be taken in any particular order, but the first thing that seems important to me is the question of how the project was carried initially, how decisions are taken when we have an exhibition project, management of the team cohesion, appropriation, ownership, etc., beyond the exhibition curator and the researchers that we're working with. Adhesion to the choices and decisions that are made, how other professions, cultural mediators, welcome reception staff that are encountering the visitors that are making verbal criticism when visiting, the entire museum team across all the professions can be associated with the project upstream. And also in order to deal with the situation, an exhibition is living, it's not to book. There are people that move throughout the exhibition, they speak, they write. How is it living? How can it evolve in terms of sharing objectives, evaluating as well? So these are delicate questions as a territorial museum, whether or not we are working with the relationships with elected officials so that we're not alone when any difficulties occur. We experienced this when we were rejected from by the assistant mayor. The proposals that we're making, what is the museum's autonomy? Ethically, are museum professionals fully independent? To what extent can they enter into dialogue with the political world that are also meant to carry some responsibility of what is happening, uh, which is a public service, a municipal public service in actual fact. So these are questions about dialogue, intentions. So I'm also now going to go back to something regarding the world around us and societal change. I understand better, and we now know this is the objective of our evening today, is that we need to keep up with changes to our world. We need to be aware of polarization, the virulence of people taking positions, the difficulty recognizing and the value of voices, even academically in the university sphere. It's difficult to recognize the authority, whether that be moral authority or just the trust that is given to that authority. So all the bodies, whether scientific, cultural, university, political, all of these bodies are sometimes reduced, have reduced power in the light of these situations. So what happens with these older mirror museums, these formula are becoming reality for discussion. We are realizing that culture is not necessarily universal. No, heritage is not necessarily a shared good for everybody. So this raw reality that we discovered quite abruptly has opened our eyes, made things clear so that we can train and prepare ourselves.
And what I was thinking about from a very intellectual perspective, thinking about the scientific relationship to the past and the historical dimension, thinking about the aspect of memory that brings together a social group and creates identity. And then in terms of heritage, we're thinking more at a political level. And what's important is to be able to negotiate what we can have in common. And actually, there isn't really a consensus, and even less so today. And these, it's very clear today that our society is really very fractured. How can we as museums be a place of debate? Of course, the debate can take place in the exhibition, but the exhibition is something that's really very concrete. Do people actually debate in an exhibition? How are we going to be able to create the conditions, the real conditions? For example, we've put in place training for our outreach workers, our cultural presenters in order to be able to ensure that the guided tours and their different events don't degenerate into useless argument, but in order to make sure that there's a debate, a healthy debate. Perhaps just two comments to wrap up. First of all, come back to this question of narrative. I've often asked myself the question, why is there so much violence? Why is there so much anger about what was just an exhibition and with words presented in a showcase? And I think what I've understood is that one of the dimensions is that part of our population who were used to come to the museum were so unused to what we were presenting, is that they felt like the narrative had been taken away from them. They felt that they had the monopoly on the narrative in Lyon, in a bourgeois town, and it's not a city where there is a lot of immigration. And there was this sense of losing control over something that they really owned. That might be part of the reason for what happened and for the violence, the aggressive response. And perhaps to also come back to something that Julie mentioned a number of times in particular was the importance of solidarity, the importance of creating links. That's what we're doing today. We talk a lot about resilience, robustness, what can make sure that we maintain solidarity and robust strength going into the future with very aggressive political fluctuations. I can't see any other solution than solidarity and connections between people, visitors, and between us and associations. In December 2023, something that really helped us was that the mayor of Lyon read out a text that had been written by the network of city museums, a network that we're part of, and they wrote a statement underlining what we're doing and the approach aligned with other urban approaches and museums. And this is something that the mayor read out and expressed, and that helped us, that supported us. And I think the development of these connections, of this solidarity between us in the coming years is going to really be very important for dealing with this very difficult situation. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. So to conclude, I'm going to hand over straight away to Vincent Moisselin. I just want to say that it really is really remarkable, everything that we've heard this evening. We've heard 3 different presentations of situations in museums, and I find them really very worrying, and that including this last presentation that we've just heard from. I said in the introduction that it wasn't difficult to convince you to work on this theme, and we understand why now. And so when we worked on this question with the CESE, with the committee and preparing for the report that we produced, we were convinced that we needed to work on this. With the CESE, the Economic, Social and Environmental Council of France, the goal is to present reports for the government and the public authorities and general parliamentarians, but also we seek to maintain debate in civil society, and that's what we're doing tonight. And we developed 13 recommendations, but I'm not going to mention them all tonight. But I focused when we prepared this evening on some of them, which I think are really connecting with the specificity of museums, even if they were designed really for a broader situation, because you heard earlier that this kind of issues are really impacting the cultural sector in general. Have just heard from our friend from the Museum in Lyon, we've put in place a guide for crisis management. We recommend the creation of a guide for crisis management, but we think, first of all, this needs to be operational for institutions that are not necessarily prepared for this kind of situation. We just heard that that you weren't ready for this conflict that you're going to encounter in Lyon. Well, it's to be expected because you weren't trained for this. So this guide, we wanted this guide to be written by people who have experienced this kind of situation. And I think ICOM France, I'm really talking to ICOM France, the government, the whole cultural sector. Is really important that these recommendations are taken into account, and it's important that ICOM is involved in discussions around this recommendation. We also recommended that there should be an annual meeting in each region of France that helps all professionals, all elected officials working, or civil servants working in a region. And it's important to organize a meeting that increases awareness of these issues of the lived expression. It's important that museums have a role in this. You know that the regional cultural bodies, the DRAC in France, have a role here. But it's important that we don't talk only about the events that really hit the media, but really all of the obstacles that are being encountered, and that those that are impacting museums are also impacted. What really strikes me tonight is that the obstacles in your field are less associated with the artistic level, even though there are examples of that. But really, the obstacles that you're facing, the issues that you're facing, are associated with your skills, associated with the scientific and historical approach that you are having. And this is a really very specific aspect that needs to be defended. Third, we put in place a recommendation which seemed rather simple in some ways, seemed rather obvious. It seemed really important that there was a training for all professionals, cultural professionals, around the legal offence associated with obstruction, which was recently put in place and became part of the law. And what is important is that all professionals understand the criminal level of this legal infraction. And so tonight we are having a kind of fast track training session, as it were, but in order to raise awareness. But it's important to train all professionals. The fourth recommendation associated with that is that this legal infraction was created in a law in 2016, but we have no case law, despite the fact that we are experiencing these situations every day. We observe that on a daily basis, this kind of infraction is happening in all sectors. Every day we're encountering this situation, but we don't manage to take these people to court, the people that are carrying out this infraction. There are two reasons for this. One is a legal reason. The criteria put in place by the legislative body were perhaps too refined, too detailed, and perhaps not cannot be properly therefore applied. In fact, the Senate has been made aware of this and is trying to correct the question. The second issue is that the victims of these infractions are reluctant about going to court because they're dependent on their funders, and sometimes it's the funders that are putting these obstacles in the way of the freedom of expression. And this means that it's very difficult to take funders, supporters, partners to court, and that's a really very big issue. This is why we recommended that other organizations could carry out the legal action for another body. We might have professional organizations or syndicates put in place that could carry out the legal action necessary. Xavier was saying earlier that it's important to have solidarity. Well, professional networks, professional organizations are there for that reason, for solidarity. I'll wrap up by saying that we really focused in on this question at the CESE, but actually there are questions around this whole area because you've talked about social media and cyber harassment, which are really a very significant issue that many people are facing. And so this led us to the question of information, and we therefore put in place a recommendation associated with information. And I keep reminding people of this because the problem with social media is the anonymity of it, because there is impunity for those who harass people because they have a different name than their real name, and so there is no real risk. And we've seen this recently with a recent legal case, and we have suggested, as the CESE, we've suggested that we invent a mechanism called the anonymity of pseudonyms, and that we've suggested that it's possible to have a pseudonym on a social media, but that first of all you have to record your official identity so that any action can be legally dealt with in the courts. So I'm really delighted to have taken part in this debate tonight, but I really am very worried by what I've heard and everything that's going on in museums. And it's similar to books. Museums are symbols, they're places of debate. And seeing the fact that the polarization of society has really got into our museums, that's a real concern, and I'm very worried about it. Thank you very much. Thank you, Vincent, for this conclusion. Yes, it is worrying. You're right. At the same time, we can see that adversity has led to teams really waking up and has led to strong professional solidarity, which is essential today, as you were saying, in order for us to stand together. Do we have time for a few questions or not? Yes, we can have some questions. Are there any questions in the chat or any questions in the room here? Somebody's raised their hand. Good evening. I'm Hélène. I'm a student. I'm learning training as a curator. I've got a question about the possibility of exhibitions. So thinking about the Museum of Brittany, was it possible to take into account people's opinions ahead of the exhibition? So I would have said that before the local communities it's better. We really could put in place a better mapping of risks in terms of the lack of a scientific consensus around the issues that we covered. We were kind of aware of the situation on the ground, but perhaps a mapping of research and the state of research and in universities ahead of an exhibition would be something that would be really essential. But then, of course, working with local groups, yes, that would be something that's really very important. That's one of the things that we really learned from this experience, because today we need to make sure that we build things together with others to think about how we understand and analyze. Because even if the narrative on the part of the curator and the museum is really very important, but we also need to talk before an exhibition with local groups, particularly on a subject like this. In a regional area, it's very, very easy because there's a whole number of associations, students and universities, of course, who are also involved in associations, who are connected into a dynamic around historical and archaeological questions. And the connection that we have with these people is something that could be developed further. We thought about putting in place a space in the exhibition which could be taken over by associations who have different perspectives on the questions that we have covered in an exhibition. That is something that could be done. We could create space for another perspective. We do this often when we give space to a carte blanche to artists or perhaps different authorities, but why not also give that space to associations? So yes, this is a way of working. Consulting community groups is something that helps to increase legitimacy, and it's something that we can see after the experience that we've had. Any more questions here in the room? Good evening. I'm Vivi. I'm not going to say where I work, but I work in a regional museum. We've talked a bit about the subject from a number of different perspectives. I work in regional museums with politics in a political context that changes regularly. We saw that the far right recently in municipal elections took over a number of municipalities. I don't really know who to ask my question to, the CSE or the ICOM or my colleagues in regional museums. But as a museum, what weapons have we got? I don't know if weapon is the right word, to protect the autonomy of museums. Because in the museum where I work, we say that museums are fixed, they're stable, and different elected officials come through. But what weapons do we have to deal with this? Well, perhaps I'm going to move a little bit, says Vincent, out of my field. But we're in a climate where people are afraid. We've got the rise of the far right, and in some cities, and people becoming more aggressive and interventionist. I would say, first of all, there is the law. You mentioned the fact that museums have a legal framework, and this protects you. What's important is to mobilize this against elected officials who are stubborn and refuse to admit it. I'm not a member of the collective of public services, but they do an excellent work. They were put together 2 or 3 years ago, and the goal is to train civil servants to resist illegal orders, in particular in the case of the rise of the far right. There's people here who are involved in this who are civil servants who are really very motivated, and I've worked somewhat with them. I think the best method today is to go and work with them and to integrate the issues of museums into these bodies here, because they don't, our civil servants don't necessarily have museums in mind, and it would be good to go and connect in with them. The membership fees are just 20 euros for the year, and I would encourage you to get involved. I encourage people really to think about this and to think about getting involved with them. I think it's service public dot something. Good evening, I'm Mikhail Mohammed. I work at MUSEM, but I'd really just like to respond to what the colleague just said. I worked for 2 years with the president of our region, from the Provence-Alpes-Côte d'Azur region. I saw what crisis management meant for a politician. 8,000 projects a year, and then suddenly someone calls up on the telephone and says, "What?" and says, "What on earth is this particular exhibition about?" So we put in place two situations, two encouragements. We first of all, flooding the narrative. It's important to write out to write out your response, and really to spread it around all of the elected officials. It's important to produce very quickly, within half an hour. Send your response, send your a written response out to 5 or 10 people who've got a voice that counts, and that's a way of really managing to calm debate and cool things down very quickly. Olivier Onfray might be a bit utopian here, but everything that's associated with research and science would be appropriated with museums. It could be used in museum. Everything that is said to defend science and research could also be put in place for museums, because museums are places of research. It would be good for people to be able to we heard from Claire Barbillon, who has got a current white paper that she's preparing. It's important to remind people that museums are places of research. Museums are places that are independent. They're places of society. And they need to be on the forefront of some conflicts. What's important is to know how to manage these conflicts, to have the right kind of discussions ahead of time, to be prepared for the complexity. It's important to deal with violence in this violent and aggressive attitude in society. And I think what would be really important for these issues to be picked up by different communities. I think we need to understand museums are places of research, and then people therefore are independent. We have to be a bit utopian sometimes, I think.
Good evening. My name is Dominique de and I am a member of the board at ICOM, and I'm also a member of the CFHA. I'm really delighted to be here this evening. I really found this topic today very exciting, and this notion of narrative that we've talked about is very important. I totally agree when you talk about the types of language that we need. We're talking about telling a story, narratives, shared narratives, complex narratives, narratives that are accepting that we sometimes move from one side to another. We're telling these narratives of the past, of today, of tomorrow. And some people are acting as if these narratives have always been written. And I think we have a role to play here. And this can only be built up collegiately. What's worrying today? It's been great to have this evening. Olivier, Claire, Émilie, thank you very much to everybody who organized this. But the communities themselves are divided. Not everybody understands things the same way. Those closest to museums, and Xavier reminded us earlier that these are sometimes the people that are not our friends. We are entering into an age of activism at the end of the day. André Lepech, and I've worked in national museums, at Quai Branly, for instance, and we have external attacks, but also internal attacks within our institutions. And it's important to see what's happening in terms of self-censorship. I'm not going to say more, but I could give you some examples. Some projects can be difficult to receive by certain people, and sometimes there are some details, certain objects that are going to cause issues that need to be removed. And it's even becoming ridiculous in some instances. Some topics are not going to be processed as it can cause anxiety. There was an anti-fascist movement that I wanted to have as a subject, but I was told that we weren't going to do that. And I think that we have internal pressure within our structures as well, from our governance, from our managers, that we need to be vigilant of as well. Self-censorship is the worst form of censor, let's say it. So professionally, we need to be aware of mechanisms that we are implementing ourselves. I was talking about this with a major theatre director who works a lot. Oh, I can't do that. It's going to cause issues again. And this is the self-control that we need to have. Self-censorship is the worst. This is real poison. And when there's external political commands getting involved as well, we're going to need to be very strong. May I speak? Yes, please go ahead. Thank you. I didn't want to steal the floor from people in the room. I can't see them, unfortunately. I just wanted to say something that's really major, and this is the question of dialogue. Let me explain. Somebody was just talking about shared narrative. Before having a shared narrative, we need to have a narrative that's heard. And what we can note, what we can observe is a real incapacity before even being able to listen. We're interrupting somebody's sentence before they're even finishing. Why is this metaphor important? What are we experiencing? We're attacking imaginaries in the plural. Imaginaries in the plural are a danger, a fear. And Xavier de la Selle was able to talk very clearly about the fear that was generated. I have found this evening remarkable. Yes, it's scaring, but it's also incredibly reassuring because there are a lot of us talking about how we can strengthen solidarity, that we are not just a value, but political action. And I'm sure that there's something that we can do. We have a very reactionary offensive, even reactionary from people that pretend not to be so. What we're experiencing in the life of culture is what we're experiencing in the field of women's rights and equality. This is not based on facts anymore. It's not based on documentation because it's really impacting our emotions. So I think the experience of the Museum of Brittany is really extraordinary here. We are seeking, we're not afraid to seek, to research, to find the answers. And yes, this may require 2 to 3 times more work, labor, patience. In the meantime, it's going to produce something. It's going to produce dialogue, which I think it's great that in Brittany, you went to find associations that didn't agree with the exhibition in order to propose different readings, different understandings. That's how we can be inclusive. Being inclusive is to say that others that don't think like us are not necessarily enemies, adversaries. What I think has been great in this evening is that I'm going to be leaving here with lots of energy because I know that's what's been worked on. I think it's great that as professionals, it's really touching. You have this desire, this capacity to go get training, to ask questions. This is added value that our non-democratic adversaries don't have. We're not even in a left and right uh, political difference here. It's about democracy, freedom. Do we have the freedom to say that there are plural imaginaries? So, yes, I wanted to say that, and thank you very much for this evening. I think that that was an excellent conclusion, ending on a positive note on a complex and delicate topic that can generate anxiety for many professionals within museums and cultural institutions. Thank you very much for that encouragement. I think we're going to go home with that in mind. Thank you very much.